Alright, today's video is going to be a build video. I've had a lot of comments and questions about people wanting to build their own Carnwennan Kingsman inspired replica pistol. So in order to do that, we'll need a couple of things. We'll need a WeTech TT33 Airsoft pistol. Now understand there's a lot of other Airsoft TT33s on the market, but this is the only one I've actually used. So you can go ahead and try something else, but I can't guarantee it's going to work. Also, you'll need a Carnwennan kit. So I'll have those available on my Etsy page, and those will consist of a pair of grips, a trigger, a fake shell, and of course the underbarrel assembly. So to kick things off, we're going to go over disassembling the piece. Alright, here we have our WeTech TT33, and we're going to start off by scoring the hammer. So this hammer is going to be flush with the frame. So we're going to use a Leatherman here, and I'm going to scratch the surface. So in doing so, there's not a chance we can smudge a pencil mark or anything like that if we're actually scratching the metal, so we can keep our spot here. So let's go ahead and take off the slide block here. We're going to remove this clip. We won't need this clip anymore, so you can set that off to the side or throw it away, whatever you want to do. And we're going to push this slide lock through, and it should come right off. So if we try to remove the slide, it won't come off. What we have to do is drop the magazine. So dropping the magazine will allow movement of the slide and come right off the frame. Just like that. Okay, next we're going to remove this lanyard ring, and we can do that with a pair of pliers. So this will just pull straight out, and then we can throw it away. We won't need it anymore. So the question I get asked the most is how to remove these grips. So what we're going to use is we're going to use a small flathead screwdriver. So we'll grab that here. And there is an arm inside the mag well, and it's got a little notch on it. We're going to hit that notch and go from left to right, okay? And that will allow us to pop that grip out. We have another arm on the inside, and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to turn it, and it's going to pop right out. Pretty easy to get these off, but we're going to take another look at this. Alright, here we have a better view of this arm with the notch in it. Lighting's a little bit better, we can see it. So think about going from 7 o'clock to 5 o'clock with the movement. And here's our look at it from the other side. Pretty simple. Alright, let's mark out our trigger. You can use a pencil, or you can score the metal however you want. But we want to make sure we mark both sides so we know how much to take off. The Carnwennan has a shorter trigger, so we want to make sure we don't take off too much. Now let's take care of this trigger block here. This is kind of holding the trigger in place. So it's just a screwdriver on top, and take out that small screw. We want to make sure we hang on to this, because the trigger might not function without it. So this is a piece we definitely want to hang on to put in later. So once this piece is removed here, just remember the orientation. We can take the trigger out. It should pop right out. But before we do that, we can take care of this pin on the side. We're not going to need that, and actually we'll fill the frame here so you won't even see a hole. So the trigger should slide out here, and remember the orientation here too. So think about the notch on the bar facing up, because it'll have to go in that way when we put it back. Alright, make sure the front sight doesn't disappear. It's not attached to anything, so it can easily fall out as we disassemble here. So we're going to take care of this recoil spring and the plug here. Just remember how all of this goes back together, how it's oriented in here, because we'll obviously put it back. So next we want to take the barrel out. In order to get the barrel out, we're going to have to remove the front barrel bushing. This is just 1/4 of a turn, and it's kind of a pain to get out. I filmed it a couple times, and this was like the smoothest I could get out. So just remember that. Now everything should pull right out of the slide. And there you have it. Alright, so pretty much everything on the left can go. We won't need it. And this is our disassembled WeTech TT33. Alright, next we're going to remove the top piece of the hammer. We know that the hammer is flush with the frame, so we're just going to take that top piece off. Okay. We're also going to make a cut here on the top of the trigger guard. And what we want to do is take that piece and fold that trigger guard down. Okay, we want that trigger guard to run right into the new underbarrel section of the pistol. My suggestion here is to super glue that front sight in place, just so it stays in place. But what we want to do with this is we want to round out the front sight here. So kind of just take those sharp edges off, and a nice rounded front sight. And the rear sight, I've marked it out just below the notch. We're going to take that completely off, okay, where I marked out. And then we'll re-notch it because the sights sit a little bit lower on the Kingsman pistol itself. Alright, here we have the magazine. As you can see, we have a lanyard ring on the bottom. What we want is a flush bottom, so we're going to cut that clean off. Let's mark out our trigger. Now I'm going to make a mark that's, I don't know, no bigger than 1/4 of an inch. So we're going to make that mark, and that's how much we're going to shave off. You'll see everything past the pencil mark here is what's going to be shown through the trigger guard. So we want to make sure we don't take off too much, so you can kind of eyeball it here. Alright? Utilizing a rotary tool with a cut-off wheel, we're simply going to remove the top half of this hammer. Alright, so we have the top piece of the hammer off. Be careful, that's going to be hot. So if you look at it, it might look a little rough, but that's okay. We're going to take care of that in a little bit. What we want to do is make sure we put the slide on and see how we did. Okay, we want to check our work to make sure it's flush. So looking at it, it looks pretty flush to me, so we're going to move on to cleaning it up a little bit. Alright, so this hammer's a little rough, but that's okay. We're going to take this file here, and we're going to file it down, take any of the rough edges, rough surface, and really smooth it out. Spend some time with this. Alright, next up we're going to cut down the rear sight. You can see I have this marked out already. I've scored the metal. We're going to use a vise to hold it in place, but if you're going to use a vise, put some material down. I suggest maybe a towel. We want to protect the finish on the frame. We don't want the metal biting into it, okay? So we're going to use the same tool we used on the hammer. So it's a rotary tool with a cutoff wheel, and we're simply going to cut right across it. Just be aware the tool might kick out with these rotary tools. You want to make sure you have a good handle on them because they can kick out, and we don't want to damage any pieces to the frame here or the slide. So just be aware of that. And also the metal is going to be extremely hot, so be careful when you're handling it. Alright, we want to re-notch this. We pretty much cut the notch off. So same tools before. Take a little time with this. If we mess this up, we might be in a little bit of trouble, so make sure our notch is straight, and then we can use a file to come in and clean it up a little bit. Alright, again, take your time with this. Now we're going to move on to the front sight here, and we're just going to be rounding it out here. Now you can use a hand file if you want. For this I'm going to use a rotary tool, same thing we've been using, and I'm not going to be cutting it. I'm going to be using the top of it and more sanding down the edges. So I'm not exactly cutting it. So we can kind of sand down the edges here, and we can finish up with a file if we want. Alright, a little work with the file. Got it nice and round. I like the shape. Turned out pretty well. I'm pretty happy with that. Also worked on the rear sight here with the file, making sure they lined up. They look pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Alright, next we're going to be making a cut on top of the trigger guard here. Remember, we're going to make that cut up top in order to fold down the trigger guard. Alright, same rotary tool with a cutoff wheel. We're going to make a cut here, and we may have to go on the other side and make a cut as well. Okay, we might have to come at this from both sides, and that's okay. Alright, so we're going to make sure we have control of the rotary tool and begin to make our first cut. A little shaky there. Alright, we've kind of made it through. We want to make sure we cut all the way through this trigger guard here. So we're done with our cut. Now this is optional. You can heat the metal up. We're going to be bending it, so using a heat gun will soften that metal up a little bit and allow it to move a little more easily. So now I'm going to move on to a pair of pliers, and we're just going to bend it down. Okay, you might have a little crimp in there. That's not a big deal because we'll take care of that. You can see that little crimp. That's not a big deal. All right, here we've cut the end of the trigger guard off. We're not going to need that. We want it flush. Here we're taking that crimp out with a little hammer action. You can throw a little heat at it if you like, but it should be pretty straight. All right, trigger guard looks pretty straight. I'm pretty happy with that. Looking at the hammer, looks pretty good after a little bit of filing. We can also file down here a little bit where we took the trigger guard off. We're going to be filling that anyway, but you can kind of take the roughness off that with a little bit of filing. Switching up to a sanding drum, we're just going to shave down the trigger a little bit. You can see where we've marked it out. We're just taking a little bit off to make room for that second trigger. Alright, next up we're going to be filling that hole in the side of the frame. Remember, we took that post out. Now we want to fill it. Make sure you don't fill the wrong hole. If you fill the slide lock hole, then we're in a little bit of trouble. We're going to use this Plummer's Epoxy or Plummer's Putty, or whatever you want to call it. We're going to mix it up, and we're going to fill that gap there. Now we have a lot of material on the inside. We want to make sure that we have very minimal because we still want the slide to function, to cycle. So I'll take off the excess where I can, and then I'm going to use the Exacto knife to go ahead and cut it flush. Okay, we want to make sure it's pretty flush on the inside. Now the outside we can be a little more liberal with. Okay, I still want to take off the excess, but we'll be sanding it down shortly. So we can work with the outside a little bit more than what we can on the inside. Alright, next up we're going to fill this gap from where we cut the trigger guard out. I'm going to put a piece of tape here, okay? And I'm also going to use some JB Weld or some epoxy. Now this tape is going to keep it in place and keep it flush. I don't want to mess around with it not being flush on the inside, so using epoxy will kind of level itself out. Alright, I've mixed up the epoxy here, and a little really does go a long way. We want to make sure everything is covered here, but make sure none of it is really sticking up. Like I said, this will self-level and kind of be smooth for us, but we want to make sure we don't put too much on because we don't want to interfere with the function of the pistol. So after about 12 hours, my mixture seems pretty tough here. So we're going to go ahead and remove the tape. And removing the tape, we got a nice flush edge here. Pretty happy with that. Looks pretty good. We'll take a look on the inside, and it looks good from the inside too. Pretty happy with that. Alright, looks like our plumber's putty has finished curing. So now what we want to do is grab some different grits of sandpaper, and we want to go ahead and start sanding this flush. So ideally we'll sand it flush, and after a little bit of paint you won't even be able to tell there was a gap there. So make sure we get it nice and smooth. Alright, that's it for part one. The second part is going to be out in a couple weeks. The second part is going to cover finishing the piece, so that's sanding, priming, painting, and having a finished Carnwennan pistol. So please join me for part two.